So with that, I introduce session number 3, Fireside Chat on the State of the Union of Blockchain and Decentralized Finance. And with that, I introduce Robert Farrokhnia, Faculty and Executive Director in the Dean's Office at the Columbia Business School, and Joe Latone, Researcher at IBM. With that, off to you.
Thank you, Sharon. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, all the attendees. Thank you for being with us today. I know we are competing for your attention at the top of the hour, lunch hour, New York time, and we're probably even competing with some Euro 2020 soccer matches. Nonetheless, we have the pleasure of being with you, and I welcome Joe on the panel. Our objective is to just have a fireside chat, give you the latest from our perspective on the State of the Union, as Sharon mentioned, on blockchain, and specifically on all the notions we've been talking throughout the conference today, including decentralized finance, financial inclusion, and all those matters that we feel are impactful and should be on your radar. My name is Robert Farrokhnia. I have the privilege of teaching at Columbia Business Engineering School. I'm also the founding executive director of our Fintech initiative. And I've been involved in the blockchain domain for quite a while. The first faculty to teach a class at Columbia, and also building the class in such a way that the language is quite accessible, requires no prior tech background. And part of the objective Joe and I will have today is indeed to ensure we can, impart with all the information we'd like you to know without resorting to a lot of acronyms or special, lingo and so on and so forth. So before we begin, I'm going to spend less than a minute, just give you a broad definition of decentralized finance or DeFi, and we come back to this toward the second half of our conversation. And in case you have any questions, feel free to use the chat box throughout. I'll monitor it and I'll interweave your questions in my conversation with Joe. So if you were to think about blockchain and all the applications that we could build out of it, we kind of saw cryptocurrencies as perhaps as the first widespread use of it with Bitcoin and Ethereum, and eventually decentralized applications. And now we're kind of entering this new era of decentralized finance. In essence, think of financial services and distill all the services that they do into their base components and all the processes down to the to the core. And if you can convert them to executable, self-executing code, we call them smart contracts to some extent, and leverage it, put it on top of decentralized network, and all of a sudden anyone with a computer and internet connection can interact. And you're taking a lot of the middlemen and third parties involved in this in the financial services supply chain, if you will, or value chain, and each extracts a fee from this. And at the end of the day, we create a financial system that does not cater well, at least, to the unbanked or underbanked. And one of the greatest promises of blockchain is indeed democratizing access, reducing costs, increasing efficiencies. So we'll get to this concept of DeFi, but the first question I wanted to ask Joe, and Joe, with my first question, I'd love for you to introduce yourself and your role at IBM as well. Would love to kind of get your thoughts about what you see in the blockchain domain and what specifically excites you. Certainly, this is a huge domain and requires expertise in a lot of different subdomains, from encryption, cryptography to distributed systems and so on. But we are interested in hearing your thoughts of what you feel like it's most exciting development you see now and also in the next 2 to 3 years.
Sure. Thanks for that. So first, I wanted to say that I work in the quantum computing group at IBM Research, which, by the way, I think is the most tech fun and interesting place in the world. But I've been involved in Bitcoin and crypto as a personal hobby and business of mine for like the last 10 years. So for example, along the lines of what you were saying, I'll try to show this. That little orange box there with the big heat sink on top is my latest little project. It's a Raspberry Pi. It runs Bitcoin, the Lightning Network. It runs Chia, Uniswap, Swap, and Urbit. And I do a lot of, personal finance with people over the world, all over the world, in a direct P2P manner using these public blockchains. It's quite, interesting and quite secure and all. And there are a lot of amazing things I could do with it. And, this is effectively, my hobby at night. And that's where I want to put a little standard disclaimer in anything I say today, that my viewpoints on this stuff are my own, not necessarily IBM's. And any crypto projects I mentioned, they're really for my own interests and in no way endorsements from IBM and such. All right. So along the lines of what you were just saying, I pasted in the chat for everybody to see. It was a statistic released this week about Bitcoin. And I found it in Twitter. And basically right now, Africa leads the world in peer-to-peer Bitcoin trading, in terms of volume growth this year. So in terms of, what you said about, banking the unbanked, which has been a, personal thing of mine since probably like 2015, and such, we're making a lot of progress, in those terms. So. And it's quite exciting. And, all these projects I mentioned, Bitcoin and Lightning especially, given the kind of things you could do with Lightning, doing, secure, very inexpensive, fast, transactions with others around the world, are quite interesting. A project like Chia is quite interesting because it's trying to do Nakamoto style consensus, the kind of consensus you see in Bitcoin that's been proven for the last 10 plus years in terms of security and such. It's trying to do that without the power consuming proof of work, which is quite interesting. Decentralized exchanges I think are on a real upslope these next 5 years. Things like Uniswap are quite interesting. And another project that's really orthogonal somewhat to blockchains, but has that property of being very personal and secure, and such, is a project called Urbit that I've been involved in for quite a few years as well, which, in my viewpoint, could potentially be something like the, identity layer, if you will, for these, permissionless or public blockchains, and such. So there's a brief introduction, some of my interests and such, so we'll take it from here.
You mentioned identity. I want to spend a little, time on that issue. Going back to mid 90s or even late 90s, it's would have been almost impossible for anyone to predict that the killer app of the internet itself would end up being something like Facebook, perhaps. So people, I get often asked, what do I think the killer app for blockchain is? Again, quite impossible or very difficult to predict. Guesses range from financial services, products or apps, all the way to some other that have nothing to do with finance. But I think at the end of the day, identity is probably going to be one of the core, components that we need to figure out. So two-sided question for you, Joe. One, your thoughts around identity and the fact that we, even Bitcoin itself has come a long way from being truly, well, at least as pseudo-anonymous as you could get, to a point in which is less of a case. So where identity do you think comes into play? And number two, we have seen with traditional, or what I call classic finance products, certain countries were able to leapfrog us, or leapfrog, the kind of a natural evolution of finance, the same way we saw, how certain countries in Africa kind of just leapfrog having no phones as opposed to having landlines. They just directly went into mobile phones. So one of the criticism and one of the impending impediments to democratizing access to finance is that the fact that engaging with blockchain is still quite complicated, and for the average consumer, setting up your wallets and so on and so forth might not just be the easiest thing in the world. So what do you think having discussed identity, what do you think the industry it's lacking, and what are the things we could do to democratize access if you're going in that direction?
So in terms of identity, I had some of the same viewpoints about blockchain and identity in the early days, and such, of Bitcoin and other uses of these public blockchains. My, experience over the years in playing with a lot of these systems, and such, is that so they haven't necessarily been, successes in a way. I don't necessarily know why they really haven't, grown, organically. I think they've taken too much of a top-down, approach, like a lot of the identity systems from enterprises were in the late 90s. You might remember things like, Microsoft Passport and, some of these systems, and such that tried to do something, quite similar. So while I don't necessarily have my finger on what the answer, to that is, those are my past observations about it. And again, the little light bulb moment I had recently with respect to Urbit, which, is this kind of personal web server, et cetera, and such, and you could go read about it, and go Google it and watch the intro video and all. And, it's a very kind of bizarre, system. And the kind of terminology they use in the system to describe the operating system and the way it interacts, et cetera, is even more bizarre. But if you get past all of that, and such, and you look at how these, identities can be used in Urbit, these pseudonyms, if you will, which satisfy, a lot of use cases, and such. If you look at the way those can be used, and you look at the recent integration of Bitcoin with something like Urbit, I could see Urbit, potentially being that, identity layer, on top of, these systems that not only applies to blockchains, but applies more generally, and such throughout the internet. And I encourage you to go try it. The Urbit folks are based here in San Francisco, and they're starting to host these, things they call, your ships or stars or planets, and such freely for you. And you could go in and play with it and kind of get in, a bit of an experience for what I'm talking about. To segue into your next question, Urbit is not for the faint of heart, and such. It's a very, complicated system. It boggles my mind a lot, and such. I meet with those folks probably once a year, in a coffee shop here, and I urge them to, perhaps make the system more consumable, by regular folks, and such, and approachable and all. They're not quite there yet, but things are, kind of getting there. But this whole issue applies to, these permissionless and public blockchains in general. Although I will say that over at least, the last year or two, the advancements, at least in terms of, personal wallet applications, especially ones that run, nicely tightly integrated on your mobile devices, things from companies like Blue Wallet and such, and not only the way they integrate with Bitcoin, because, Bitcoin is not necessarily something people are going to interact with, directly day to day on the Bitcoin blockchain anyway. But their integration with the payments network on top of Bitcoin called Lightning is quite impressive. I had a colleague, just a couple of weeks ago, doing a demonstration for some folks, download the app, and within 5 minutes, he set it up, and I sent him a payment, over the Lightning network from, that little node, that little Raspberry Pi that I just showed you on my kitchen table here, and such. So that stuff has come a long way. Lightning payments are starting to be integrated by a lot of merchants. And even, this week, I think it was Square, announced that, they're going to be accepting Lightning payments on their network. So Square, you won't be able to just use it to buy, and hold Bitcoin, if you will, as some kind of investment. But you'll actually start to be able to use Square now to make payments to, local merchants, et cetera, in Bitcoin over the Lightning network, and such. So that stuff has come a long way. And I expect, that trajectory, just like I mentioned with the decentralized exchanges, I expect that trajectory to, continue fairly steeply as well over these next few years, and such. So.
Well, speaking of that, we indeed have come a long way from Satoshi's paper, whoever he, she, or group of people are in 2008, And we have gone from Bitcoin protocol to Ethereum protocol, which is a Turing complete language. It had, the first iteration or generation of it, as you alluded to earlier in your remarks, used proof of work, which is very, energy intensive, environmentally complicated, and also issues with scaling, right? So this notion of scaling, interoperability, and standards, I'm a lot more optimistic that we got to figure out the scaling the same way we figured out scaling for internet. Internet wasn't built to have billions and billions of people on it, and yet it's operating at those levels. But when it comes to standards, now there are a number of competing protocols with Ethereum, the Solanas of the world or Polkadots of the world. And this brings to mind, and the question to you is, what do you think about having this number of competing protocols at the same time, and whether the ecosystem will support having these a number of these protocols in place that may or may not be interoperable, or whether you think you're going to get to a convergence point in which common standards would emerge?
Yeah, that's another good question, and such, because, there are something like thousands of these quote unquote cryptocurrencies, which you could think of as, in a lot of ways, their own protocols, et cetera, out there today, and such. And it's hard for me, even doing this as a hobby to keep up with a lot of these things. Although I run into some quite interesting things. There's another one called Algorand, which, I'm kind of a big fan of. There are actually some former IBMers, and such working on that. But certainly coming from, IBM research, I certainly encourage, a lot of innovation, which is going to bring a lot of, new ideas and people's, own ways of doing things that they think is better, et cetera. And may the quote unquote best one win, or at least the one that gains some traction, out there and such. And I'm confident, and in fact, there are, DeFi projects that do just this. And Algorand, in fact, is partially one, meant to integrate with legacy systems, as opposed to perhaps other blockchains, and such. But I fully believe that, these will, the ones that do emerge will have some interoperability. And I'll give you at least one example. Lightning was initially built, as a payments layer for Bitcoin. On the other hand, if you look the way that's evolving, it's quote unquote standard. Even though there are no standards bodies, formal standards bodies behind a lot of these projects, by nature, by the way, that they form, more organically, from the system and the people who are developing code, et cetera. Which is the way it should work, and the way these standards should work. Even with Lightning, what you see now is that Lightning isn't necessarily built, just for Bitcoin. Its real goal is to be able to, transact as payments any cryptocurrency out there, and there are multiple cryptocurrencies that run on top of it today. Not only that, but you could take, the Lightning Network more generally and say, gee, what does it mean when you're, you have this Lightning Network, just low latency, very inexpensive to use, cryptographically secure, et cetera, P2P network out there moving some Bitcoin from one person to another. Well, you're really moving a piece of data, and that, that data, moves over this, network that performs its own routing, if you will, somewhat like the internet. And what's interesting about it is that data can be anything, really. It doesn't necessarily have to be cryptocurrency. It could be, messages. Somebody built a P2P messaging system on top of Lightning, et cetera. So while a lot of these projects might have some initial, focus of where they're going, you could see how they're expanding, and integrating, with other systems out there that are emerging as well. And that's not only happening in these public blockchain projects, it's also happening at the layer of the actual client applications, where you're seeing these e-wallets be able to, interact with practically any, blockchain out there, and such. And what you're seeing happen is, the winners are the winners are growing organically, and coming out of it and such. The one example being, especially this last year, the growth in the Lightning network and such, in terms of the number of nodes and the liquidity that's out there that's moving along this network. It's very much like the early days of, things like Bitcoin, and such.
Yeah, so let's speak to kind of something you mentioned. So now we've moved away from just pure theoretical application of blockchain to this experimentation, some of which have gotten a lot of traction, but there's still a lot of hype in this domain. Unfortunately, a lot of bad actors that promote certain things purely for financial gain, and some investors may, lose money, and certainly the promoters themselves are in it to make money without regard for, whether that what you're doing is legally or morally correct. So how do you suggest we separate the hype from reality in this domain, especially within DeFi? Because, for those of us who are more purists than the promoters, certainly we are excited by the premise and all the applications we could do. But, I'm someone who sits at the intersection of academia and practice. I love to do, the leading edge research in this domain and fintech in general. But at the same token, we have to be very cognizant of realities of the marketplace, everything from regulation, from rules, know your customers, anti-money laundering measures, to consumer uptake and hardware and software challenges and so on. So what methodologies do you deploy in your thinking in determining, or at least being able to separate hype from reality?
Yeah, so it depends, who you are, in approaching this, and such. And my own approach, I'm somewhat lucky and unlucky in a way, that one, I have a real interest in this stuff, and my nights are free. So the reason I have bags under my eyes is I was up until 2 or 3 a.m. on this little Raspberry Pi doing some, work last night and such. And that's the only way, I can approach it. Because you're right, there are a lot of bad actors out there. I don't know what to believe in a lot of this hype space and stuff. So I have to get my hands on it, myself, to kind of experience it and believe in it, and such. So that's my personal approach, but I could tell you that it takes a lot of time and effort and all. The other way, at the other end of the spectrum, if I wanted to play in this area, and such, to at least experiment with it as a more normal type of user, I might go, buy $100 worth of Bitcoin or something, or less, and start playing with it on something like the Lightning Network, or start to, toy with some of these, systems, myself. Otherwise, you just have to wait. You have to wait for a company like Square to make it more consumable, to their kind of consumers, and such. But if you're in that middle ground, this little Raspberry Pi I have sitting here, cost me $100. So it wasn't much, for me to invest, to get my hands on this stuff and play with it. And, installing Bitcoin and Lightning on this was literally the click of a button. There's a project out there called Umbro, which takes all these, blockchains and containerizes them and runs them all within Docker, and they do a nice one-click install for this stuff. You click a button, a few hours later, your own personal Bitcoin node is synchronized. You have your own Lightning node. You hook up one of these e-wallets, to it, and all of a sudden you're, transacting all within, a few hours, and such. So depending on how much time you have, your interests and such, you could either do like I do, which is spend way too much time on it. Take a middle ground where it's, fairly inexpensive, in terms of time and money, to start to toy, with some of these systems, and ask, reach out to some experts who have toyed with them already to give you some viewpoints on them, and such. I try to keep an open mind about practically all of them. And on the last end, the other far end of the spectrum again, within the next year, I predict Square, PayPal, and these folks are going to be offering, these types of cryptocurrency payments, to their users. And for people who want to play in this space, they will, and such. Certainly, people like my son, and the upcoming generation who, are open, to some of these ways of, transacting financially, especially given that, most of them live on Venmo these days for doing that kind of stuff. So, so whether they're transferring, fiat US dollars, among their friends, or Bitcoin, or some digital gold or whatever, I don't think it's a big deal to them to do this, kind of thing. So I do look forward to that kind of stuff.
Three quick observations. Certainly, I totally agree with you. There's just so much happening in this domain. It's impossible for any of us to keep up with it. So it's just a matter of doing your best. Reading is probably one of the most underestimated tools at anyone's disposal. And I certainly appreciated your use of you kind of putting constraints around your engagement with in terms of getting on board and using Raspberry Pi as opposed to use the latest laptop or desktop. So this is aside from security considerations. I think it's a fantastic way, given all the documentations, all the experimentation done by other developers in this domain, that you can go and learn from them and kind of tweak and eventually kind of figure it out on your own. There's obviously value to that, right, as well.
Yeah, and my employer probably my employer probably wouldn't like me putting these on my work laptop either. So,
as I mentioned, security considerations, right? And I certainly look forward to we would have more consumptive applications in blockchain as opposed to speculative that maybe have seen them to a large extent thus far.
Right.
But let me ask you, my last question is around security. And I know we have a fantastic panel coming up right after hours with Professor Bello, and someone I have a tremendous amount of respect for. But in as this domain explodes in interest and activity, certainly you have a launch of a whole lot of protocols. And even with the best of intentions and the best minds, it might miss some inherent bug in a protocol that would lead to some not so desirable outcome. DDAO, I guess, is one of the prime examples of this. So if you could quickly share your thoughts around tools or standards or systems or protocols we have to put in place in order to ensure that as more and more of these applications launch, and there's for the code review and just ensuring that this is as robust as it could be and it would perform as close to expected as possible. All in the understanding that, at least in my experience, I've only seen one piece of software that came close to being almost perfect, but code is written by humans, and we make inadvertently, we make mistakes. So we're curious about your thoughts in closing.
This is another excellent question, by the way. These were good ones. So on the good side of this, on the positive side, these projects are open source, so we could rely, to some extent on the community, and such for vetting a lot of these, and see what the community does say about it, among our trusted peers, and such. The other end is that one of the first things I do with any of these new projects, is to attempt to vet that particular aspect of these projects, its security and its use of crypto, and its claims, et cetera, with probably a very small handful of experts that I know in this area. One of them happens to be the inventor of DSA, and I'll always shoot him off an email saying, hey, David, can you tell me about this? And, he'll give me a thumbs up or down. And if it's down, I won't touch the thing again. If it's up, then I'll at least trust it to some extent, and such that I could, start to play with it at all. But it's a very good question, and for people who don't have that network of experts, like I have, especially like I have in IBM, as well, in IBM research, to ask these questions, and such, the community, does a decent job of vetting, these kind of things. But it is up to you to get beyond the hype and go look at, some of what the community is saying about it, and such, because those little details can be buried, and they're not the kind of things you see up front, a lot of times, and all. Good question, though.
Thank you, Joe. Well, with that, I'll extend my gratitude to you. I only had 2,000 or 3,000 more questions I wanted to ask you, but certainly our time is up. And with that, I thank you for your time, and thanks to organizers for the event as well. And Sharon, back to you.
Yeah, thank you all. And thank you for the well thought out questions too, by the way. Those are quite good ones.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
You both, Robert and Joe. I guess I'll have some reading to do tonight. I'm not
time for donuts.
Quite ready for shifting my investment portfolio, but we'll see. Of course, everybody top of mind. I don't think anybody isn't thinking about security and privacy these days, given what's been in the news lately. It's sort of always in my mind what you click and what you share and what happens to everything about you and whether it's yours anymore.